There was a creative ferment that went beyond just trying to do a slasher film with a greater body count.
If you're going to become the new kid on the block, you've got to somehow top everything that's been done before.
There was a boom of horror film production in the 1980s. I think production spiked 33%, so it was a vast increase in the number of horror films being made.
Well, there's a theory that horror movies thrive during repressive regimes. You know, the 70s and the 80s were no exception.
When people look back at 70s movies, they're astonished at how violent they are, and astonished at how much nudity there is. And that's because that was what was going on in the culture at that time. The 80s was the Reagan era. So, you know, the pictures started to they had a lot less nudity and a lot less sex. And sex was always punished.
We were in the second decade of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. 1980s was the decade where we became aware of AIDS, and AIDS became an epidemic. You sort of have, in that time, all of these things coming together that I see as an apocalypse mentality. This mentality that there's going to be the end of the world coming very soon. And to use a sort of quotation from the 80s, that trickles down into the cinema.
In the 80s, everything was about excess. You know, big cars, big hair. Let's see, what else was big? Oh yeah, horror movies.
If you look at the history of the movie business and why people make films, you can't make a movie until recently, unless you had a lot of money. And no one was going to give you money unless they thought they were going to make money.
There was a company called Avco Embassy Pictures, and they produced a number of pretty seminal horror films. And I think the success of these pictures did a lot to kick off a sort of a new genre revival, and major studios started to imitate.
It was a real boom time for horror movies. It was a very exciting time. That's when I first started at Fangoria magazine, and that's when the circulation of the magazine started going through the roof.
Horror has always been one of the most popular genres, and it also is a genre that can be produced fairly inexpensively.
So if you could deliver enough either monster or gore or whatever the element was, you could rely on a certain return.
Of all the genres, the horror movie is probably the one that uses the most cinematic tools to be able to create what it's about. With horror movies, you have to suspend people's disbelief. You have to create suspense. You have to create atmosphere. How it looks is incredibly important. How it sounds is important. The music is important. Most really good filmmakers have dabbled in trying to create, you know, horror movies.
To horrify someone is easy. Show a gruesome picture, you can horrify someone. You want to create suspense, generate suspense through the audience's concern for the characters and the story and all that stuff. That's more difficult, that's more challenging.
Some of the greatest masters of horror were doing their greatest work during the 1980s.
You had David Cronenberg, John Carpenter, Tobe Hooper, George Romero, Joe Dante, me, Wes Craven. A lot of very interesting people making horror pictures, most of who took it pretty seriously as filmmakers.
I borrowed your razor, and, well, you'll read all about it.
As we get into the 1980s, you're seeing that we're continuing the gritty cinema of the 1970s, where we're demanding things to be very naturalistic and very real. So much so that for a good portion of the 1980s, the slasher films are just sort of unkillable boogeymen going after babysitters.
There's all those films where you just let's have attractive kids and then murder them.
Basic run of early 80s pictures were the impaled teenagers movies.
A lot of horror movies seem to have similar stories. You know, good-looking teenagers making out, only to wind up on the business end of a madman's chainsaw. I mean, it's not the best way to spend a Saturday night, but what the heck? At least it's better than going bowling.
No chemicals or preservatives, just 100% honest-to-goodness hickory smoked meat. It takes all kinds of critters to make Farmer Vincent fritters.
It takes all kinds of critters to make Farmer Vincent's fritters. That was the ad line from Motel Hell, which is one of my favorite horror films of the 1980s.
They're good animals, not like taking care of chickens or hogs.
In the film, there are two killers, the farmer and his sister Ida.
What is this, dog style?
No, ma'am. Hogs.
They run a motel, and the people who come to the hotel, they sort of turn into sausage.
What could be more wholesome than a brother and sister making sausages out of their guests? Of course, I had to wonder if it was kosher. I guess it depends on how you kill them. Ha! Oy.
The hypocrisy of these people, is just astounding. The farmer at the end of the film has a deathbed confession.
I used preservatives.
There started an interesting trend in about the mid-1980s in horror. Some very clever filmmakers began to incorporate comedy into the horror film.
Comedy and horror in the 1980s went together hand in hand. Maybe that should have been severed head in hand.
There's humor in life, and to be realistic, and if you're going to be scary, you have to be realistic. You have to be fun.
You will never find an audience that wants to laugh more than a horror movie audience. And one of the things that I learned was that you better give them something to laugh at, or they will start laughing at the movie itself.
Time for incoming mail!
As soon as Chainsaw started, from the very seconds of its opening, there was a hush in the crowd. We all knew this is something heavy. This is, wait a minute, what is this?
The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre was such a horrifying and grueling experience. And Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 was a satire.
I love this town. This town loves prime meat.
Tobe Hooper is a really interesting director. He took characters who had been one way in the 1970s, and he said, you know what, in the 1980s, let's say these characters benefited from the Reagan Revolution. So the cannibal family, the killer cannibals in that film, they're running a chili stand. They're having a chili competition.
Now here's a family living the American dream. They had an idea, and they toiled night and day to make it a reality. So what if they were cannibalistic murderers? They owned their own business. That is what capitalism is all about.
This is now, it's 2007, we did it in 1986. So this is 21 years old, and you know what's amazing? Still lights.
These filmmakers were paying heed to the fact that the characters in the film were aware of horror movies.
Did you see that movie, Night of the Living Dead?
Yeah. That's the one where the corpses start eating the people, right?
Dan O'Banion's Return of the Living Dead. When I saw it, I had very low expectations because I thought, what a shitty idea, and George isn't doing it. And I actually thought it was pretty funny. And the idea of that zombie saying, "Send more police," made me laugh. And the hysteria of some of the performances, and Leanna Quigley being naked for no reason. And what I liked was the shamelessness of it.
Dan O'Bannon made the wise decision that, okay, we've seen zombies before, let me do something different.
Zombies are terrifying. I mean, being stalked by a mob of ugly, filthy, relentless creatures with just one thing on their mind, it kind of reminds me of high school.
He came up with very funny characters. He made his zombies speak and move quickly. And he also had some really fun special effects scenes. And, we really hadn't seen that before.
When I saw it all put together, it was obviously hilarious. So I was like, oh, that's the kind of movie we're making. It's a horror movie, but it's funny.
It doesn't take you out of the narrative so that you say, oh, I don't believe in this world anymore. Instead, it works very hard to create scenes that are funny to the viewer, but not necessarily funny to the people who are involved with them.
You know, it looks like rigor mortis is setting in.
What do you mean, rigor mortis?
I've always thought that because horror movies are so close to absurdity anyway, that you have to find the humor in it.
What's your name? Hi, I'm Chucky, and I'm your friend to the end. Heidi-ho.
I love the Dan Curtis television show called Trilogy of Terror. And I think Richard Matheson wrote a short story called The Zuni Doll, which Dan Curtis did. It was just wonderful. And I knew that there was a terror in dolls.
Hey.
Tom Holland uses his films as text to comment on the 80s, with Child's Play referencing toys and children's toys as programming in commercials and consumerism and the Cabbage Patch craze.
There was a universal fear that Child's Play was tapping into, which is all of us, when we were kids, have looked at our playthings, especially the dolls or the action figures, and said, what would happen if they come alive?
Hi, I'm Chucky. Wanna play?
I think the great thing about Chucky is he has such a personality that actually the audience, you love to hate him. You know, when he's in the elevator and says,
ugly doll. Fuck you.
You know, it's just a huge laugh.
It was a movie that you could think is pretty silly, a killer doll. But the film was well written enough, well directed, and well acted that it just took off with the audience. That something small could not only kick you in the ankles, but slash your throat.
Chucky had a big crush on me. And I have to admit, he really knew how to handle a knife. But that jumper suit and those red shoes and that hair, it was like a fashion nightmare. Oh well, tough luck, Chuck.
David Cronenberg is the most thoughtful filmmaker working in the horror genre. His films are very thought-provoking, they're very intellectual, they're very unique. No other filmmaker can imitate a David Cronenberg film.
The Brood is David Cronenberg's, his fascination with the flesh. These organic midget monsters come out of Samantha Eggar. That's a creepy movie.
All of his films, to one extent or another, are about sort of this imperfect machine called humanity. And the idea in The Brood is that these creatures are coming out because of the psychological rage of this one character.
These movies are about the human body, the vessel we're in, and disease and decay. You know, some of us were interested in becoming writers and some of us in directors, but there was a whole other group like Rick Baker or Stan Winston or Dennis Muren. There are a lot of these guys who were more interested in makeup, more interested in special effects. So the real sea change in the late 70s all the way through the 80s and 90s till now has been in special effects.
We saw an explosion and a revolution in special effects and special makeup effects. For the first time, Hollywood's craftspeople can turn everyday actors into werewolves and demons and zombies and ghosts. Utilizing new innovations in latex effects, animatronics, all kinds of makeup substances and appliances that you really couldn't do as much in the 70s and before that.
In the 1980s, audiences were demanding a greater amount of realism in their films. They wanted to see more and they wanted to be realistic.
With computer effects these days, you could remove wires, create new monsters from scratch, or enhance whatever's already on the screen. Of course, some things don't need any computer enhancement. They're perfect just the way they are.
The Howling was part of the werewolf trend of 1981 with American Werewolf in London and also Wolfen. Joe Dante was the director.
I met John Landis when I came out here in 1975, and he was a film buff, and we got along great. I knew John through that entire period. We weren't living together, but I knew him well, and I knew that he wanted to do a werewolf picture, but he had never gotten it together.
I had written an American Werewolf when I was 18, so it was like 1969, and I didn't make it till 81. And then Rick Baker, who I'd been talking about it with since 1971, he said, "Oh, I'm working on a werewolf movie." Like, what?
One session with Rick doing some stuff for us, and all of a sudden, Rick get a call from Rick. John's doing his picture. I can't do yours. So, Rob Bottin can do it because he's my protege. And it all worked out fine. Rob took up the slack, and with very little money. I mean, the whole movie cost just over $1 million. And the original budget for special effects was only $50,000.
In the past, when Lon Chaney Jr. turned into a werewolf, it was done with a series of dissolves from one makeup to another. But in The Howling, it was a very physical and very painful process.
The transformation sequences, which were done with groundbreaking air bladders and condoms and things that are underneath pieces of latex that can be expanded and blow up. And it makes the transformation look like no others had done, and also painful. When we were trying to do, groundbreaking effects with physical materials, you were bound by what was available. The liquid latex and the mechanics and all those kind of things that were being created limited you. But within that limitation, you found a certain freedom.
The care taken, not only in the creation of the werewolf, but in how it was lit and handled on the set was so intricate, That's really what made the movie.
Those people had incredible imaginations, inspiring a new generation of effects artists throughout the 80s. People like Rick Baker and Stan Winston would hire enormous crews to bring a lot of these nightmarish visions to life.
Well, compared to now, it was very crude. It was just all mechanical. You had no CGI, so it had to be done live, which I think is a great way, and in some ways a preferable way to do it, because you have more control as a director over what happens. And if it doesn't work, you've got to make it work one way or the other.
To me, I much prefer effects that can be done with the actors there, where the actors can actually interact with the effects. They can see them. When you're doing CG, you've got a green screen or something, and you're telling them there's this really scary monster coming at you, and they have no idea exactly what it is.
But what was interesting about the 80s is that there were some attempts in the 80s to have a back trend and bring up something else. For instance, there was a resurgence of supernatural films. We had Tobe Hooper's Poltergeist. We had John Carpenter's The Fog. A number of very talented directors were trying to kind of get the supernatural film, the ghost story, back into the forefront.
There's that scene in Poltergeist 2 where Craig T. Nelson swallows the evil worm at the bottom of the tequila bottle. I mean, talk about someone not being able to handle his booze. That's the last time I ever invited him for 2-for-1 happy hour.
John Carpenter did some very interesting work in horror in the 1980s. Of course, we think about him in the 70s doing Halloween, but in the 1980s, he just went from sort of strength to strength. Carpenter is not only sort of the foremost stylist, I think, but I really think that he had a lot going on thematically.
The Fog had an impact on 80s horror because it was like an old-fashioned ghost story. It had a great cast. It was a fun little drive-in movie that seemed to win Carpenter even more fans.
By the end of the 80s, the horror genre shifted away from slasher movies and more towards psychological thrillers. I guess audiences decided they'd rather have their heads played with instead of just having them removed with a chainsaw. As if.
I don't know anyone who's ever been killed by a vampire, a werewolf, a monster from space, a giant squid, what else? I mean, gorillas. I don't know of any people killed by monsters or zombies, but I know thousands of people who've been killed by madmen.
Well, John, let me just tell you that several of my friends met their grisly ends thanks to monsters. Zombies ate Jerry, vampire got Cindy, Tom chainsawed him too, and Bob, of course, was done in by a werewolf. I mean, never mind that the werewolf ran him over in a car. It still counts.
At the end of the 80s, people began to realize the faceless slasher is kind of played out.
Almost done.
In the early 1990s, there were films where your serial killer was suddenly not this faceless, speechless monster in a mask, but a very charismatic, very interesting person.
Oh, and Senator, just one more thing.
Love your suit.
I don't know what all the big fuss was about Hannibal Lecter. Sure, he ate people and... Oh yeah, he wore that one guy's face. But... Hello, girls. The guy is a doctor.
A horror film has intricate relationships and stories that build and, flow.
All of the tools of cinema are on display in horror films. They have to be.
Film is, as of now, still the best medium for the fantastic because you can see it. You can make it real.